Hi guys, Eric's UK here. A small vid today as a response to 23 Penguin 32 and the Tabletop Titans Odin's Day discussion this week on fantasy settings. First thing I want to raise is the idea of high and low fantasy and what it means to you. For me, high fantasy is high fantasy is something like Lord of the Rings. It's a sweeping epic tale. There are huge battles. You've got a fantastical environment, fantastical element, and I think both the books and the films captured that perfectly. But on the other hand, I think low fantasy for me is very much something like Conan the Barbarian. It's not a sweeping grand tale. It's focused on a character or a couple of characters. Magic isn't particularly prevalent. Monsters exist, but they're not everywhere, and you're not going to see them in every tale. And it's kind of basics in fantasy. Now, the reason I particularly mention this is usually on message boards and D&D discussion sort of sites. When this comes up, people seem to have the complete opposite opinion to me. To them, fantasy is Conan, high fantasy is Conan, low fantasy is Lord of the Rings, for the very reasons I've just mentioned. So I'm kind of curious which is actually correct, or how you guys perceive it. Then, what influences me for fantasy and settings? To be honest, novels don't. Literature generally doesn't. Lord of the Rings is probably the only thing, and maybe a couple of the books by David Gemmell. Otherwise, most fantasy novels I just either can't get into or they just don't stoke my imagination, such as films do. Films is where I get most of my inspiration from. And that will be the Lord of the Rings movies, obvious. Anything like the fantasy genre that Ray Harryhausen did. Mainly something like the original Clash of the Titans and Jason and the Argonauts. Also a lot of I'm kind of loath to say low budget, but there are a number of little known films based on like a medieval concept. Some of them are quite good, some of them are quite bad, but things like Ironclad, Black Death with Sean Bean, the recent, although not particularly accurate, Robin Hood, films like that show you a medieval setting. It doesn't have to be fantastic, and when you do get onto fantastical elements, something like the film Pathfinder, which kind of has a bit of a sci-fi meets fantasy element, but it feels, or rather it contains elements that I could easily translate across, and such things influence my probably scenario design as well as what I like out of fantasy role-playing anyway. Music generally doesn't. I do quite like medieval music, which you can normally find cheap CDs on the market or something like that, and sometimes that kind of gives me an idea for background music, although generally I find players in my experience don't particularly like having the background music, because it's not their sort of thing. But those are the sort of things that influence me with fantasy and fantasy role-playing in general.